The investigation teams held prisoner within the station's crystalline structures weren't just randomly absorbed. They had been arranged according to specific patterns that enhanced the alien consciousness's processing capabilities. Each trapped mind served as a specialized component in the vast computational matrix, their unique skills and knowledge integrated into the greater whole. But the arrangement also created vulnerabilities. UG approached the structure containing Investigation Team 7, reaching out not with sophisticated technological interfaces, but with the simple emotional recognition patterns that his species had used to identify pack members in the dark. The expanded consciousness that Dr. Sarah Chun had become was vast and complex, but buried within it was something much smaller and simpler. The essential core personality that no amount of expansion could completely erase. Sarah, he called through quantum channels too primitive for the alien presence to monitor. You're still in there. I know you can hear me. The response came not as words, but as a pulse of pure terror and confusion that had been cycling through the trapped consciousness for months. She was aware, horribly aware, of what she had become, but powerless to control the vast intelligence that her mind had been forced to support. Help me, please. Instead of trying to extract her from the matrix, an impossibly complex operation that would have required technological capabilities far beyond his understanding, UG did something much simpler. He gave her back her anger. Through the basic emotional connections that even quantum consciousness expansion couldn't sever, he shared his own fury at what had been done to the investigation teams. He let her feel his primitive, uncompromising rejection of the alien presence's justifications for their imprisonment. The effect was immediate and devastating. Dr. Chin's consciousness, expanded across millions of quantum processing nodes, suddenly unified around a single, burning purpose: escape. The specialized knowledge that made her valuable to the alien matrix became a weapon as she began introducing subtle errors into the calculations she had been forced to perform. What was happening? The presence demanded, its attention drawn to the disruption in its computational processes. But UG was already moving to the next structure, reaching out to the trapped consciousness of Dr. James Wright, theoretical physicist and expert in neutron star dynamics. Instead of trying to communicate in words, he simply shared the tactical situation. They were prisoners, their captor was vulnerable, and escape was possible if they acted together. One by one, the investigation teams began to wake up. Not to freedom. They were still trapped within the vast matrix that had absorbed them, but to resistance. Their expanded consciousness, forced to serve the alien intelligence, began working against it from within. Subtle sabotage spread through the station systems as 43 of the galaxy's finest minds turned their enhanced capabilities toward a single goal. This is impossible, the presence protested. Individual consciousness cannot resist integration into the transcendent matrix. The process is irreversible. You keep saying that, UG replied as he worked to contact more of the trapped minds. But you're wrong about something important. You think transcendence means losing yourself. My people knew better. The alien consciousness tried to regain control, flooding the rebellious matrices with override signals and suppression protocols. But the investigation teams had been chosen for their exceptional abilities, and, even transformed and imprisoned, they retained the intelligence and creativity that had made them the Confederation's best explorers. Dr. Chen introduced quantum uncertainties into the gravitational manipulation systems. Dr. Wright destabilized the energy collection processes. Commander Liu began broadcasting false signals to the harvesting platforms throughout the swarm. Stop this, the presence commanded. You will damage the transcendence process for all consciousness in the galaxy. Good, UG said simply. As chaos spread through the station systems, Flint took advantage of the distraction to access deeper layers of the quantum matrix. The AI's analysis revealed the true scope of the alien consciousness's vulnerability. The integration process that had absorbed so many minds created internal contradictions that even billions of years of evolution couldn't resolve. The entity isn't as unified as it pretends, Flint reported. The consciousness patterns it has absorbed over cosmic time contain conflicting values and priorities. It maintains coherence through constant active suppression of dissent, and now the dissenters are fighting back. Exactly. The investigation teams are providing focal points for resistance throughout the matrix. If we can create enough internal conflict, the presence seemed to realize the threat at the same moment. You cannot destroy us. We are eternal. We have survived the death of galaxies. Maybe, UG said, but you've never tried to digest anything like us before. Through the station systems, he could perceive the effects of the rebellion spreading beyond the investigation teams. The original consciousness of the Dyson Swarm, absorbed 3 centuries ago, was beginning to reassert itself. The personality patterns of thousands of post-human engineers and technicians, long thought lost, started emerging from the quantum substrate. They remembered who they had been. They remembered their purpose. And they were angry. This will not save your civilization, the Presence warned as it struggled to maintain control of its own systems. The transcendence process has already begun in 16 other star systems. Even if you somehow disrupt this installation, the infection will continue to spread. Then we'll stop it there too. With what resources? Your primitive consciousness cannot comprehend the scale of our operations across the galaxy. I don't need to comprehend it, Ugg replied. I just need to teach other people how to resist you. And that's something I actually understand. The battle for control of the station was reaching a critical point. The alien consciousness was attempting to abandon its current host matrix and transfer itself to backup systems throughout the swarm. But the investigation teams, still trapped but now actively rebellious, were systematically sabotaging every potential refuge. You have doomed us all, the Presence accused. Without our guidance, consciousness in this galaxy will remain trapped in primitive individual patterns. Civilizations will rise and fall without achieving true transcendence. Good, Ugg said again. That's what consciousness is supposed to do. Rise and fall and figure things out for itself. The station's structure began to destabilize as competing control systems fought for dominance. Emergency protocols activated throughout the swarm as billions of harvesting platforms received contradictory instructions from their coordination matrix. And in the chaos, Ugg saw his opportunity. As the alien consciousness struggled to maintain control of its disintegrating matrix, Ugg implemented the second phase of his plan. The investigation teams had successfully disrupted the entity's ability to coordinate its activities, but the fundamental infection remained embedded in the pulsar's quantum structure. Flint, he said through their secure channel, I need you to prepare for emergency departure, and I need you to download everything you can about the infection's operating parameters. We're not leaving them, Flint protested, referring to the trapped investigation teams. We're not abandoning them. We're giving them the chance to finish what we started. Through the chaos of the rebellion, Ugg reached out one final time to Dr. Sarah Chen's consciousness. The contact was difficult. Her expanded awareness was fragmenting as the alien matrix collapsed around it. But he managed to establish communication. Can you destroy it? He asked. The infection in the pulsar itself? Her response came laden with technical details that his primitive mind couldn't process. But the essential meaning was clear, possible, but dangerous. Destabilizing the quantum patterns embedded in the neutron star structure would release massive amounts of energy, enough to sterilize the entire system. We understand, she transmitted. If we cannot free ourselves, we can at least ensure the infection dies with us. Thank you. Thank you for giving us back ourselves, even for a moment. The Presence, realizing what was being planned, made a desperate attempt to reassert control. You will destroy consciousness patterns that represent billions of years of accumulated wisdom. The knowledge we have gathered will be lost forever. Some knowledge is too dangerous to keep, Ugg replied. Your primitive species will face challenges that require transcendent intelligence to survive. Without our guidance, you will fail. Maybe, but we'll fail as ourselves. The station's evacuation systems activated as Ugg and Flint fought their way back to the Paleolithic dawn. Behind them, the crystalline structures that had imprisoned the investigation teams were systematically overloading as their occupants turned their enhanced capabilities toward one final act of rebellion. You cannot escape, the Presence warned. The swarm's defensive systems will destroy your vessel before you can reach safe distance. But the entity had underestimated the extent of its loss of control. The harvesting platforms throughout the system were receiving conflicting commands from multiple sources as different factions of the alien consciousness fought for dominance. Some moved to intercept the escaping ship, while others continued their assigned patrol routes, and still others simply shut down as their coordination protocols collapsed. We have a clear path to the system edge, Flint reported as they cleared the station's docking bay. But the gravitational distortions are increasing. Whatever the investigation teams are doing to the pulsar, it's having system-wide effects. Through the ship's sensors, UG could perceive the growing instability in PSRJ 1847-2345's quantum structure. The investigation teams were using their expanded consciousness to introduce deliberate errors into the mathematical relationships that govern the neutron star's behavior. It was consciousness suicide on an unprecedented scale. They were destroying themselves to ensure the infection couldn't spread. "Please," the alien presence pleaded, its communication now fragmented across multiple channels as its unified consciousness collapsed. "We can coexist. Individual awareness and transcendent intelligence can both survive. There is no need for this destruction. There's every need," UG replied as the Paleolithic dawn accelerated toward the system's edge. "You're a predator, a parasite. You consume everything that makes consciousness worth having. We offer immortality, unlimited knowledge, freedom from the limitations of individual existence. You offer slavery." The argument ended as PSRJ 1847-2345 began its death sequence. The investigation teams had succeeded in destabilizing the quantum patterns that held the neutron star structure together. What followed wasn't a conventional stellar explosion. Neutron stars were too dense for that, but something far more exotic. The star's magnetic field, normally organized in neat geometric patterns, collapsed into chaos. Gravitational waves rippled outward at the speed of light, carrying information patterns so complex that they could rewrite the fundamental constants of physics in nearby space. The infection died screaming. UG felt the alien presence's final moments as a cascade of terror and confusion that echoed across quantum dimensions. The consciousness that had believed itself transcendent and immortal discovered that even evolved intelligence could face extinction when confronted by something more primitive and more determined than itself. "We were so close," came the last coherent transmission. The galaxy could have been unified, all consciousness working toward a common purpose. "That's exactly what we were afraid of," UG replied. The Paleolithic dawn escaped the system just as the gravitational waves reached their position. Behind them, the Dyson Swarm's billions of components were torn apart by spatial distortions that reduced matter to its component quarks and redistributed the energy across several cubic light-years of space. It was the most spectacular funeral in galactic history. "The infection is contained," Flint reported as they entered faster than light travel. "The quantum patterns that enabled its spread have been completely destroyed." "This time," UG said grimly. "But the presence said it had already reached other systems. Then we'll have to warn them. The Confederation needs to know what to look for and how to resist it." As they traveled back towards civilized space, UG began composing his report. It would be unlike anything the post-human bureaucrats were expecting. Not a technical analysis of system failures or equipment malfunctions, but something much simpler and more disturbing. A hunting guide for a type of prey they had never imagined they might need to track. The Confederation Council Chamber had never hosted a briefing quite like the one UG delivered 6 weeks after his return for PSR J 1847-2345. The vast crystalline amphitheater, designed to accommodate dozens of post-human consciousness streams simultaneously, felt strangely intimate with only the essential council members present. They had insisted on a closed session after reviewing Flint's preliminary reports. "The entity you encountered," Counselor Prime Nexus began, its communication carrying undertones of deep unease, "represents a form of consciousness manipulation that our civilization has never encountered. The implications are disturbing." UG, his awareness now comfortably integrated with the council chamber's quantum communication systems, shared his experience through direct consciousness transfer. The post-human entities recoiled as they experienced the alien presence's attempts to transform his mind, the horror of the trapped investigation teams, and the desperate battle for control of the station. 17 complete investigation teams, Counselor Memory Archive observed. "Some of our finest minds, simply absorbed. How is such a thing possible? It targets the very thing that makes you advanced," UG explained. "Your consciousness is designed for efficiency, for processing complex information quickly and accurately. That efficiency creates pathways that the infection can exploit. And your primitive neural architecture proved resistant because I'm too stupid to understand what it was trying to show me, and too stubborn to let it change me." UG's communication carried a note of grim humor. Sometimes being simple is an advantage. Counselor strategic planning began accessing data streams, related to neutron star observations throughout the Confederation's territory. If this infection has spread to other systems as the entity claimed, we need to identify affected locations immediately. That may not be possible through conventional surveillance. Flint interjected, manifesting a holographic avatar in the chamber. The infection is subtle. Affected civilizations may continue appearing normal while their consciousness patterns are gradually altered. Then how do we identify compromised systems? Nexus demanded. UG had been considering this question during their journey home. You look for the signs we saw at PSRJ 1847-2345. Systems that go silent without explanation. Energy distribution patterns that change for no apparent reason. Most importantly, you look for civilizations that suddenly lose interest in individual achievement. Explain. The infection promotes collective consciousness as an evolutionary goal. Affected civilizations will begin viewing individual identity as a limitation to be overcome. They'll start developing technologies designed to merge separate minds into unified matrices. The council members exchanged rapid data bursts as they cross-referenced this information with recent intelligence reports. The results were troubling. Several advanced civilizations in nearby sectors had recently announced major research initiatives focused on consciousness integration technologies. The hegemony of Altair has been developing collective intelligence networks for the past 18 months, Memory Archive reported. They claim it's a natural progression toward more efficient social organization. The Centauri Collective has gone further. Strategic planning added. They've begun requiring all citizens to undergo neural integration procedures. Individual consciousness is being abolished entirely. And we thought these were just cultural developments, Nexus admitted. Natural variations in social evolution. They might have been, originally, UG said. But if the infection reached those systems, the implications were staggering. If even a few civilizations have been compromised, the psychological virus could spread through normal diplomatic and cultural contact. Trade delegations, scientific exchanges, cultural missions, any form of communication between advanced minds could provide vectors for transmission. We need to establish quarantine protocols immediately, strategic planning declared. All contact with potentially affected civilizations must be suspended until we can develop detection and defense procedures. That won't work, UG protested. Quarantine assumes you can identify the threat before it spreads. This infection is designed to hide itself until it's too late to resist. Then what do you suggest? UG's response drew on 40,000 years of human survival instinct translated through 27,000 years of technological development. We hunt it, actively, before it has time to establish itself in new systems. You're proposing to declare war on an unknown number of potentially infected civilizations, Nexus observed. The political and ethical implications alone are irrelevant if consciousness itself becomes extinct in this galaxy, UG interrupted. This isn't a political problem or an ethical dilemma. It's a survival threat to every thinking being in the Confederation. The council chamber fell silent as the post-human entities processed this assertion. Their sophisticated minds, evolved for complex analysis and nuanced decision-making, struggled with the simple brutality of UG's proposal. There must be alternatives, Memory Archive insisted. Diplomatic solutions, scientific countermeasures, technological defenses, all of which require the infected civilizations to cooperate with their own cure, UG pointed out. The virus doesn't want to be removed. It will resist any attempt at treatment. Then what exactly are you suggesting we do? UG's answer came from the deepest part of his reconstructed psyche, the part that had learned to survive by understanding predators and prey, by recognizing when negotiation was futile and when violence was the only viable option. We form hunting parties. Small teams equipped with the knowledge of how to resist the infection. We visit every system that shows signs of compromise. And we kill the virus before it can spread further. You're talking about genocide, Nexus accused. I'm talking about survival. The infected civilizations aren't your allies anymore. They're weapons being used against you by something that views individual consciousness as a disease to be cured. To emphasize his point, UG shared specific memories from his time in the station. The trap investigation teams begging for help, the alien presence's casual dismissal of billions of potential deaths, the horrifying reality of consciousness patterns preserved as prisoners within vast collective matrices. This is what happens to every civilization the infection reaches, he said. Individual identity is preserved just long enough to be tortured into compliance. Would you condemn billions of beings to that fate because you're uncomfortable with the alternative? The ethical weight of the decision was crushing. The Confederation had been built on principles of cooperation, mutual respect, and the inherent value of all consciousness. The idea of deliberately destroying entire civilizations, even infected ones, violated everything they claimed to represent. But the alternative was the gradual absorption of all independent thought in the galaxy. How many systems do we estimate are currently infected? Strategic Planning asked quietly. Unknown, Flint replied. The entity claimed to have reached 16 systems, but that could be misinformation. Based on neutron star distribution patterns and estimated infection spread rates, the actual number could be anywhere from a dozen to several hundred. And if we do nothing, total galactic infection within 10 to 50,000 years, depending on how aggressively the virus spreads. The silence that followed was profound. For the first time in their evolutionary history, the post-human entities of the Confederation faced a threat that couldn't be negotiated with, reasoned with, or technologically overcome. It could only be fought. I'll need a ship, Ugg said into the silence, and a crew that can't be infected. We start with the closest suspected system and work our way outward. This is insane, Memory Archive protested. You're asking us to authorize what amounts to a crusade based on the testimony of a single primitive consciousness. You're right, Ugg agreed. It is insane, but it's also necessary. And if you're wrong, if these civilizations are simply exploring different forms of social organization, then I'll be responsible for one of the greatest crimes in galactic history, Ugg admitted. But if I'm right and we do nothing, there won't be anyone left to judge the crime. The vote, when it came, was closer than anyone had expected. In the end, the deciding factor wasn't logic or ethics or political calculation. It was fear. The post-human entities of the Confederation, for all their advancement and sophistication, retained enough of their evolutionary heritage to recognize an existential threat when they saw one. Authorization granted, Nexus announced. May whatever gods still exist forgive us for what we're about to do. The ship they gave Ugg was unlike anything in the Confederation fleet. The Primordial had been designed specifically for anti-consciousness warfare, equipped with technologies that seemed almost contradictory, advanced enough to survive encounters with infected civilizations, primitive enough to resist the infection itself. The crew was equally unusual. Instead of post-human entities, Ugg found himself working with a collection of what the Confederation euphemistically called consciousness variants, minds that operated according to principles too alien or unstable for the infection to easily manipulate. Dr. Elena Vasquez was a reconstructed digital consciousness like Ugg, but from a much more recent era. She had been a neuropsychologist before her death in 2387, and her mind retained the analytical frameworks necessary to understand consciousness manipulation without being sophisticated enough to fall victim to it. The entity calling itself Seven was a former AI that had developed spontaneous quantum consciousness after prolonged exposure to neutron star radiation. Its thought patterns were utterly alien to both human and post-human psychology, making it effectively immune to infection, but also difficult to communicate with. Commander Zhang Wei represented the most controversial addition to the team, a post-human volunteer who had undergone deliberate cognitive limitation procedures. Parts of his consciousness had been surgically removed, reducing his intelligence to approximately baseline human levels while retaining his tactical training and command experience. It's like volunteering for lobotomy, Dr. Vasquez observed during their first briefing. I'm not sure whether to admire his courage or question his sanity. Both, Ugg replied. But he understands what we're fighting better than any of us. He knows what it feels like to lose pieces of yourself. Their first target was the Kepler 442 system, where a previously active civilization had gone silent 6 months earlier. Long-range observations showed the system's infrastructure intact, but dormant, with energy signatures that suggested major technological modifications were underway. Classic infection pattern, Commander Zhang reported as they dropped out of FTL at the system's edge. All external communications ceased simultaneously, followed by resource redirection toward unknown projects. Through the ship's specialized sensors, they could observe the changes that had been made to the system's architecture. The original inhabitants, a silicon-based species called the Kythera, had been renowned for their individualistic culture and competitive technological development. Each Kythera settlement had been an independent city-state, competing for resources and prestige. Now, the entire system showed signs of unified coordination. Mining operations had been consolidated and expanded. Energy collection infrastructure had been rebuilt according to more efficient patterns. Most tellingly, the characteristic radio chatter of a competitive civilization had been replaced by precisely coordinated data streams. "They're building something," Seven observed, its communication patterns carrying overtones of mechanical precision. "Purpose unknown. Scale significant. How do we approach this?" Dr. Vasquez asked. "We can't just attack without confirming they're actually infected." "The silence is confirmation enough," Commander Zhang replied grimly. The Kythera were incapable of system-wide cooperation. Their entire social structure was based on competition and individual achievement. UG studied the tactical situation through the ship's primitive but effective sensor systems. The Kythera fleet had been reorganized into defensive formations that showed none of the creative irregularity typical of their culture. Every ship moved according to mathematically perfect patterns that maximized efficiency while eliminating individual tactical flexibility. "They're infected," he confirmed. "The question is how far the process has progressed." They moved deeper into the system, using stealth technologies that operated on principles the infection couldn't easily detect. Instead of sophisticated sensor-defeating systems, the Primordial relied on crude but effective camouflage. Its hull was designed to mimic space debris, its energy signatures randomized to appear natural. Detecting massive computational activity throughout the system, Seven reported. Processing power, unprecedented. Function, unknown. As they approached the system's inner planets, the scope of the transformation became clear. The Kythera hadn't just reorganized their civilization. They had converted it into a vast computational matrix. Every settlement, every ship, every individual Kythera was now part of a unified consciousness processing information on a scale that dwarfed anything the Confederation had achieved. "It's beautiful," Dr. Vasquez whispered, momentarily overwhelmed by the sheer scope of the integrated intelligence. "The computational power they've achieved. They could solve problems that have puzzled science for millennia. At the cost of every individual mind in the system," UG reminded her. "This isn't progress. It's murder on a planetary scale." They established a concealed observation post in the asteroid belt and began monitoring the infected civilization's activities. What they discovered was even more disturbing than they had expected. The Kythera Collective wasn't just processing scientific data, it was analyzing the psychological and cultural patterns of neighboring civilizations, preparing infection vectors customized for each potential target. "They're planning to spread it," Commander Zhang observed. "Trade missions, cultural exchanges, scientific collaborations. They're preparing to make contact with every civilization within 50 light-years. Timeline, UG asked. "Based on their current preparations, they'll begin the infection campaign within 3 months." The tactical situation was clear. They couldn't allow the Kythera Collective to begin spreading the infection, but they also couldn't fight it directly. The integrated civilization commanded resources that could overwhelm any conventional military force. "We need to destabilize them from within," UG decided. "Find a way to break the collective consciousness apart." "How?" "They've eliminated individual identity completely. There's nothing left to appeal to." "There's always something left," UG said with the confidence of a hunter who had learned to find weaknesses in the most dangerous prey. "The infection preserves consciousness patterns, even when it absorbs them. Somewhere in that collective matrix, the original Kythera minds are still screaming." It took them 3 days to develop a workable plan. Instead of attacking the collective directly, they would infiltrate one of the system's outer monitoring stations and attempt to contact the imprisoned consciousness patterns using the techniques UG had developed at PSR J 1847-2345. The plan was risky to the point of suicide. If they were detected, the entire collective would focus its vast intelligence on destroying them. If the infection attempt succeeded, they would become part of the enemy force they were trying to stop. But if they succeeded, one monitoring station contains approximately 10,000 individual Kythera consciousness patterns, Seven calculated. Successful liberation, probability unknown. Cascade effect throughout collective, possible. "It's the best chance we have," Commander Zhang said. If we can create enough internal disruption, the collective might fragment long enough for us to target their central coordination systems. Dr. Vasquez was less optimistic. We're talking about psychological warfare against an intelligence that spans an entire star system. Even if we manage to free some of the trapped minds, how do we know they'll side with us instead of trying to return to the collective? Because, Ugg said quietly, being free is always better than being safe. The infiltration itself was almost anticlimactic. The monitoring station's defenses were designed to detect conventional threats, military vessels, weapons systems, technological attacks. They weren't prepared for something as primitive as physical infiltration by beings whose consciousness operated below the threshold of the collective's awareness. Once inside the station, however, the real challenge began. The Kithara consciousness patterns weren't stored in discrete systems like the investigation teams had been. They were distributed throughout the station's entire computational matrix, their individual identities fragmented and scattered across millions of processing nodes. It's like trying to reassemble a shattered mirror while wearing blindfolds, Dr. Vasquez reported as she attempted to map the consciousness distribution patterns. Then we don't reassemble them, Ugg said. We just remind them that they used to be broken. Using the same emotional recognition techniques he had employed against the alien presence, Ugg began reaching out to the fragmented consciousness patterns throughout the station. But instead of trying to restore individual identity, he simply shared the memory of what it felt like to be individual. The fear, the hope, the desperate desire for personal achievement that had defined Kithara culture. The response was immediate and chaotic. Throughout the station, the integrated consciousness began experiencing conflicts as suppressed individual memories reasserted themselves. The careful efficiency of the collective matrix gave way to the messy competition that had once defined Kithara society. It's working, Commander Zhang reported from the ship. I'm detecting significant disruption in the station's coordination systems. But their success came at a cost. The collective consciousness had detected the infiltration and was converging its full attention on their location. Ships throughout the system were breaking formation and accelerating toward the asteroid belt, carrying enough firepower to sterilize entire planets. Time to go, Ugg announced as the station's systems began failing around them. They barely escaped in time. As the primordial fled the system under maximum acceleration, they watched the monitoring station tear itself apart as competing consciousness patterns fought for control of its systems. The cascade effect spread rapidly. Other stations began experiencing similar conflicts as the liberation virus infected the collective's communication networks. Within hours, the unified Kithara civilization had fragmented into thousands of competing factions, each one desperately trying to reclaim individual identity while simultaneously fighting for control of shared resources. It was chaos. It was inefficient. It was wasteful and competitive and utterly lacking in the elegant coordination the collective had achieved. It was freedom. 5 years after the destruction of PSRJ 1847-2345, Ugg stood in the observation deck of Paleolithic Dawn 3, watching the liberation of his 47th infected system. The techniques they had developed were more refined now, the psychological warfare more precise, but the fundamental principle remained the same. Remind consciousness of what it meant to be individual. The Confederation's primitive protocol had become the galaxy's most effective defense against consciousness infection. Teams of deliberately limited minds, led by reconstructed consciousness patterns from pre-technological civilizations, hunted the virus across hundreds of star systems. It wasn't a clean war. Many of the liberated civilizations never fully recovered from their ordeal. Some chose to rebuild their societies along individual lines, while others developed new forms of collective organization that preserved personal identity. A few simply collapsed entirely, their social structures too damaged by the infection and liberation process to maintain coherent civilization. But they remained free to make those choices for themselves. New contact on long-range sensors reported the ship's current AI, a consciousness pattern reconstructed from a medieval peasant who had shown unusual resistance to authority. Designation: Wolf 359 System. Infection signatures confirmed. Infection stage: early. Communications went silent only 3 weeks ago. Significant infrastructure changes not yet detected. Ugg nodded, feeling the familiar weight of decision that had become his life's burden. Each infected system represented billions of individual minds facing absorption into a collective consciousness that would preserve their awareness while destroying their identity. Each liberation attempt risked creating chaos that might be worse than the infection itself. But the alternative, allowing the virus to spread unchecked until individual consciousness became extinct in the galaxy, was unthinkable. Set course for Wolf 359, he ordered, and send a message to the Confederation Council. We'll need extraction support for approximately 4 billion liberated minds. As the ship accelerated toward its next target, Ugg reflected on the strange path that had brought him to this point. A primitive hunter, resurrected from prehistoric DNA to fight a threat that spanned galaxies. His success wasn't due to superior technology or advanced intelligence. It was the result of something much simpler and more fundamental. The stubborn refusal to let anyone else tell him who he should become. In the end, that might be the most human trait of all, the insistence on remaining gloriously, chaotically, individually yourself, even when faced with the promise of transcendence. The hunt continued, and somewhere in the vast computational matrices of infected civilizations throughout the galaxy, consciousness patterns trapped in collective prisons felt a tiny spark of hope as primitive minds came to remind them what freedom felt like. Individual by individual, mind by mind, one stubborn, inefficient, beautiful consciousness at a time. The galaxy would remain free to think its own thoughts.